So today I wanted to talk about UIs that you can add to your game. So let's say I have just finished setting up my game. I've set up all the spawn points, all the player respawn points. I've set up a chat box, a network manager. I've set up things like voice, scene transitions, the scene manager, set up my scene database. Now everything's ready to go, except I don't have a UI for my game. Now UI is pretty complicated when it comes to multiplayer. Building the visual elements is quite easy, it just takes time. But adding the logic together to work with those visual elements is difficult. So what I've done is I have built 3 very common scenarioed UIs in very different formats to help you combat this issue. So here I have one already added, but I'm going to delete that. And one very important thing to know is if you ever delete a UI like that, it's going to leave behind all of its settings. So here it has certain settings that it's set, but more particularly the Unity events. So if I come back to my Unity events, you'll see some things are missing. So go ahead and just clean those up. Now it's not going to break your game to leave those Unity events there as blank, it's just bad practice. So let's go ahead and remove them. Okay, so with all that removed, I'll save my game. Let's go ahead and look at the UIs that you can add. So if I go to the UIs, add, pre-built, you'll see there's 3 different UIs that you can build here. There's a free-for-all, there's a team-based, and there's a co-op. So let's look at the easiest one first, and that's the co-op. So, in fact, I am gonna delete this and remove that just so you can see what it does. So let's go ahead and say add pre-built, co-op, add DarkFantasyUI. It says, now warning, are you sure you want to do this? What it's going to do is it's going to overwrite a bunch of settings in your network manager, like allow team damaging, your team name, initial spawn points, auto spawn player. Now, are you sure you want to overwrite those is what it's saying. So for me, I want to say yes, I do want to do that. Now it's going to come up with another pop-up window, and it's going to say, hey, you may need to actually generate the list for selectable players in your UI. So when you allow people in your UI to change the player they're going to be playing as, that's based off of a variable in the UICoreLogic called selectable players. And you'll see here, it says you can add all the selectable players by going to CB Games, UI, add all player prefabs to UILogic. It says, hey, thanks for the tip. And it's going to automatically select this. So let's go ahead and look at this. So the DarkFantasyUI, the ModernUI, the FutureUI, basically all UIs that I've built for you make use of a component called UICoreLogic. And like the name suggests, it is core logic for the UI. So remember that tip that it talked about? This is what it's talking about, the selectable players here. Normally, so in my particular case, I've populated this already, but normally this will be a 0. And so basically you have no selectable players. No one can switch players in their game. So you need to make sure you populate this list from every player here in your resources folder. So if I come up here to CB Games, UI, add all players to prefab logic like it talked about, you'll see it automatically populates with every single player prefab that was in my resources folder. So I'm gonna basically you either do that manually or do that there. So the scene list here, in this particular UI, we don't care about a particular scene list since the host of the game is the one that's setting the scene that we're going to be going to. There's no voting system. There's no allowing other players to select a scene list, so we don't care about that here. The default index is the scene that you're going to load if you have not set a scene previously. So this could happen if the host of the game basically starts the game without selecting a scene. So we want to cover that scenario and by setting a default level index. So that index is talking about, if we come up here to our build settings, you'll see there's a number here. That's what that index is referring to. So if one isn't set, it's going to load the Invector shooter melee scene. And you could set that to whatever you want it to be. So that covers the core options. Now, everything in here is optional if you want sounds with the UI. I don't imagine why you wouldn't want sounds, but this is all the sound settings for the UIs. You can look through that. And then the loading page, so all the UIs are set up as such where there's a panel and then there's a loading page. The panel is the actual UI itself. The loading page is just the page that is displayed when you're transitioning from one scene to another. And then these are all the options for that page. And then this is important because other scripts will be referencing these values to set things like the scene image, the scene description, the scene titles, the loading bars, all of that. So make sure this is all populated based on whatever you build in here. And then the UI events, I've tried to make this UICoreLogic extremely modular. This is basically just something that you're going to reference as core underlying logic that you'll make use of. So the very first thing that this does, and you'll see if we look at our game view here, there's no UI displayed. It's because by default, you'll see all of these are disabled. But you'll see the very first thing that it does is on the start call, it calls to enable the panel. And it does a few things here, like it saves the player UIs. And what that's talking about is this UI here that's from Invector. It saves those UIs so it knows what UIs to turn on and turn off. And then it disables those saved UIs as to not compete with that player UI. That's talking about this loading bar, these little images here. It's going to disable those, and you'll see that when I click play. And then the loading, this is like when a scene is completely loaded. It'll trigger this when you're about to start a scene load and when the level has completely loaded, meaning the loading bar has completely loaded, but maybe the scene isn't completely loaded. You'll see there's different events for that. And there's naming events for things like if you input a name wrong, if you put it successfully, errors. This is just a generic error that is called. And that's even in here, the network manager, when we added it, it added a few Unity events like call network error occurred for things like it failing to join room, failing to join disconnect, failing to join photon, connection failures. A lot of things can happen there. It's going to call this Unity event, which is going to do a whole bunch of things. Feel free to look through this. Basically, it's mostly to disable every element in the UI except for the UI error page. And then if we go to room events, this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. But when you failed to create a room, when you were successfully creating a room, when you're waiting to join the photon lobby, not the lobby of a room, there's a difference there. When you have started a session from your photon room, when a countdown has started, or when a countdown has stopped. And then you can use this in any way that you want, but without further ado, let's actually look to see what DarkFantasyUI actually is. So let's go ahead and click play, have a look at it. So you'll see it enabled the UI because of that on start call here. So let's go ahead and enter my name. And we can find a match, and it joined the photon lobby. And this is what I'm talking about. You can actually look for your rooms. There's obviously no rooms hosting right now, but you can join it that way. Let's host a custom match. We'll call it my test match or something. And then here you'll see the map selection. If we come up to here, we can change that map selection, and that goes back up here, this scene list. It's not important because it's getting set by me, the room owner. You'll see it's set here. So there's no reason to maintain a scene list for other players to interact with. And then this selectable players here, it's very important. If I come up here to select player 0, it selects that 0 element. Select player 1, it selects player 1, and again, you can design these buttons in any way. You can call, this one fighter hero, this one mage, whatever you want. Just make sure that corresponds to things in here, and these are all modular elements. But if I select player 3 or 2, you see nothing happens because there's no element that corresponds to that index. So I did that on purpose to help you visualize that. And then, if I click start match here, it's going to automatically start the match and immediately load the scene that I have set here, which happens to be index 1. And if I never set a scene here, you'll see it's index 0. And when we first joined the game, you saw that index 0 was selected, which was this scene here. So you'll see how important that is there. So that pretty much covers it here for the Dark Fantasy UI. So let's look at another one. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this. And remember, because I deleted it, I need to come here and clean up these events. I'm going to ignore it for now because that just takes time. So I'm going to come here to say team-based. It gets a little bit more complicated. So let's say add FutureUI. Thanks for the tip. And if we come up here to Network Manager, you'll see it changed our team settings. It even added these couple of things. We actually should have cleaned this up. This co-op is from the previous setup, so we need to remove that. We need to make sure that we clean up that UI correctly. So here it added our teams that we could select there. It did all those things. Let's go ahead and jump into here. Again, the scene list is empty. There's no reason to have it. These are all populated with events related to this Unity UI. So let's go ahead and click play here without further ado. So let's click continue. Again, I entered my name wrong. So let's go ahead and say test, and then goes back to here to saying, hey, if you entered your name wrong, we're going to set the particular text to what the error was and enable the name error page. So you can see how that is a little bit more modular for you. Again, set up very similarly. There's no hosted matches, but you can join them here. Host a game. Now this one, you can see it's a bit more complicated because it is team-based. There's 2 separate teams. There's no countdown, so if I first ready up, everyone in the scene needs to be ready before the start match button even appears. But when I click start match, it's going to immediately start the match. This one offers you the chance to change teams, and you'll see it's very similar to the co-op based where I can change my map, I can change my player, and again, that's all set here in my UI core options. So that covers the future UI. So now let's look at the most complicated UI there is, and that is the free-for-all modern UI. So let's go ahead and add this. Let's look at the network manager. Our initial teams is blank because it removed everything. We allow team damaging, and we don't set the team name because, like I said, this is a free-for-all match, so everyone should be able to damage each other. So if I click on Modern UI, this is where actually the scene list is going to be very important. Now for this particular example, I have populated it already with my scene name, my scene icon, and it's different for every scene, so it's all random. Now when this comes out and gets released, the selectable players in the scene list for all UIs is going to be at 0, so you need to make sure, depending on what you're doing, that you populate the scene list and the selectable players. Selectable players, I cannot stress this enough, it needs to be populated for all UIs. Otherwise, you will never be able to switch your players correctly. So please, please, please do that, and make sure you please make sure you do that. So let's go ahead and look at the UI and just get a better idea of how this works. So this one is almost completely different from the other UIs. It has the same name error checking. But you'll notice this one doesn't say host a match or find a match. It's only private or public. So this one, when you click public match, it's going to immediately try to find and join any open room. And it's not going to let you set the scene name. It's just going to immediately join one. So you'll see if I click one, it says joining master server. It says creating room. You see that said where it created room really fast. It created a room because there were no existing rooms open. And so there can be a room made, but if it's completely full with players, it's not open. And so it's going to generate a brand new room, and then other players will start to join this. You'll see there's no start button anywhere in here. That's because there's logic in here to say when there's a certain number of players that join this room, automatically start the countdown timer. And this one, the scene list is important. You'll see it randomly just selected 3 items from my scene list. It selected scene 3, scene 4, and scene 5. And then I can vote for them, and this will be displayed across the network. You see my match type is public. So let's leave that. Let's host a private match. Now this is going to look a little bit different as well. You can join a private match or you can create a private match, but you know, it's going to look the same here. So let's say create private match, and now let's say my test room, and let's set that room password to 123 and create the session. And you'll see that the scenes are different because it randomly generates a map for you to vote for every single time. This is completely random. But now the start match is available, which is different because I don't want to start this based on the number of rooms. Since this is a private match, I want to start it when I want to start it. So if I click start match here, you'll see the countdown timer is going. And that allows people to actually join the match. So if I come back in here and I say join private match, you'll need to know the room name exactly and the password exactly in order to join that private room, and then you'll be able to start. So you got a quick overview of all 3 UIs here. Let's just a quick refresher. The free-for-all UI, the team-based UI, and the co-op based UI. So let's say I like these UIs and I like the elements inside of these UIs, but I don't want to use that UI specifically. I want to use the logic that's in those UIs in my own custom built UI. Well, that is just fine because I have made all of these completely modular, but all of these pieces are going to rely on the UICoreLogic. So the UICoreLogic, there's no particular place you need to put this, although I would encourage you to place all the UIs under the network manager, as the network manager component is persisted between scenes. Otherwise, this is going to get destroyed, and if you are trying to save logic between scenes, it just becomes impossible. So just make sure you put it underneath your network manager, just like the chat box is. So let's say the modern UI, it's always broken into 2 parts. So the panel here, which is what I just went over, and the loading screen, which is here. The loading screens are always pretty much set up the same. There's a main image, there's an overlay to that image, there's a title text, description text, background to the loading bar, and the loading bar itself. That's pretty self-explanatory. There's not a lot to go over there. Just expect you to put a little bit of effort in there and to look through that. Now this is where it's going to get a little bit complicated. So now in each of these UIs, it's set up differently, but I've tried to make it so that you don't need to actually dive into this element further. So like if I wanted to see certain logic for starting a hosted game, you wouldn't need to go in here to see specific components. I guess you would actually have to go in here and look to see what I do on a button click to see like what things I'm calling in the UICoreLogic. But if I wanted to see certain modular elements, if I come to this lobby, you'll see there's a whole lot of components here. So there's visualizers, there's trackers, there's enablers, there's generic countdowns and event things. So going over all of these, if you look, there's always a helpful page here, and it tells you what it's going to do. But let's say I don't know what components are completely available to me. So if you open up the network in this Invector Multiplayer, go to Scripts, UI, and Generics, everything in here is made for you to build your own UI based off of these elements. So these generic things are basically generic actions that are going to take place in order to call just a Unity event, and that Unity event can do whatever it is that you wanted it to do. So this generic countdown is going to count down from a particular number to 0. When it hits 0, it'll call the Unity events. This event caller will call Unity events if you have enabled the object, disabled the object when it starts, when it awakes, all of that. This kick player is usually used inside of player logic if you want to boot them from the game or not. Visualizers, these will generate child game objects on a target parent game object based on certain things. So this will generate child game objects based on the number of players that are in the room. This one will generate it based on the number of available photon rooms. And then trackers will change existing things based on other networked events or network information. So basically all of these are going to change text objects to say show the connection status, or show the room name, show the player count, show the random scene list, show the saved scene list, show the selected player, show the selected team, show the session type, show the votes. So that'll be helpful there. This enablers will do like it says, enable or disable objects based on rules. So this will enable objects if all players have selected that they are ready, if the chat box is connected, if you're the room owner, or if this is a particular session type like public or private. So with all of that, that should help you build your own UIs. And now in each of these, if I come here to this core logic, this selectable player list can be populated automatically instead of manually if I come and say add all player prefabs to UICoreLogic. And that's going to automatically add everything here from my resources folder. And you'll see in this particular case, I only have 2 players. So it only added 2. The other one, you're expected to add your set scene list that you want to display here in the UI. So with all of that, please join my Discord if you find any bugs, if you need help, and please collaborate with each other. That's why I made it, is to help promote the collaboration there. Building a multiplayer UI, the logic there is very difficult. So with all of this, I hopefully should make your lives a lot easier and make building your own custom UI elements a lot easier. So again, please contact me if you have any errors. Thanks. Bye.